Welcome to Iowa Ideas In-Depth Week. This kicks off our third In-Depth Week for the year. This week's focus is on the rural and urban divide. And today's session is a review of the oversimplification that we get into when we talk about the rural and urban divide. I want to thank ITC as our presenting sponsor of Iowa Ideas. They've been with us from the beginning, and we appreciate the partnership and the sponsorship with them. Without that, none of this would be possible. I also want to introduce David Peters is going to be our guest today. And he will be joining us here momentarily. And so the urban rural topic is something that we have zoomed in on. We did an introductory report this past weekend that's available on thegazette.com, and I would encourage folks to take a look at that. This is the first of 5 panels that we have. Tuesday will be maintaining services in rural areas. Wednesday will be bringing new ideas into action. Thursday, workforce. And Friday will be keeping education rural in vibrant areas, looking both at the K-12 and higher ed systems. We have an opportunity to ask questions. And so if you have a question, you will be able to use the Q&A button at the bottom as we get things going. And I will say that Dr. Peters is a professor of sociology and the extension rural sociologist at Iowa State. His work broadly encompasses social and economic change in rural communities. Special research areas include rural population health, rural poverty and inequality, and rural crime. He's a faculty advisor for agriculture and rural policy studies major at Iowa State and teaches courses on rural sociology and applied stats. Previously, he was an assistant professor of ag economics at the University of Nebraska and has been a senior researcher for the Missouri Department of Economic Development and for the Rural Policy Research Institute. And so, I wanted to kind of throw to you for some opening remarks, and I apologize for as you think about the urban-rural divide, what comes to mind? Is that something that you think, is an oversimplification, or I will throw to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways there are very important and significant rural-urban divides. But on the other hand, I do think that rural and urban areas share some common challenges as well. So first I'll talk about what I see as sort of the common divides. The 2 biggest ones are that rural America, including rural Iowa, is hemorrhaging people. And that is driven mainly by outmigration. Rural Iowa has very large amounts of outmigration, and it's often said our 3rd biggest export besides corns and hogs are young people in rural Iowa. And that is exacerbated, particularly since the pandemic, and that prior to COVID, births and deaths were essentially equal. So there was no natural gain in population. Since COVID happened, given there were many deaths in rural Iowa and in rural U.S. generally, and as people sort of delayed childbearing during the pandemic, now rural Iowa is shrinking. There's more deaths than births. And so there's not enough babies in rural Iowa right now, and there's sizable outmigration. So those are 2 long-term pressures that just means rural Iowa is lagging in population growth. The second is in terms of job creation. There's some regional variations, of course, across the state of Iowa, but generally speaking, rural Iowa is far lagging behind metros, including Cedar Rapids and Des Moines and Iowa City, in terms of job creation. And the pandemic slowed that down a little bit, but whereas metro Iowa has begun to recover a lot of those jobs lost during the pandemic, rural Iowa has not been able to do that. So those are the first 2. The other is the nature of those jobs in rural versus urban Iowa. In rural Iowa, the job base tends to be primarily manufacturing. It tends to be on education and healthcare services. So if you think of the major local employers, it's usually the schools and the local hospital. Government, there'll be county government, city government, as well as agriculture. And so what we consider sort of traditional rural industries that growth rates are relatively slower. There's a lot of global competition on agricultural commodities, manufactured goods from East Asia. But the problem is that there's a lot of global competition, but rural areas, because that's where most of the jobs are, they're subject to those pressures. Whereas in urban Iowa, the job base is mainly professional and business services, finance, insurance, and real estate, as well as kind of the information economy, and those are all growth sectors. And the last major divide, I think, and perhaps the most important one from a political point of view, is in sociology. We talk about that there are two different cultures that have rapidly emerged in the United States. The first, that predominates mostly in rural Iowa, is what we call the traditionalistic culture, or traditional working class culture. And that is a culture that really had a sense of fatalism about what people did, that really you're not in control of your own destiny, that people's identities were given by attachment to your group, whether that's your gender, your class, your race, and your community. And this idea of a communitarian spirit, that people were willing to assume their individuality in kind of in return for supporting their community, and that achievement is based on your character, not necessarily your material success. And so that kind of culture was dominant in the United States through most of the 40s, 50s, and up until the 1980s. And beginning in the 1980s, this new set of cultural norms began to emerge, and that would be the progressive set of cultural norms of the professional middle classes that were essentially focusing on basically free will, that people were entirely at liberty to choose their own life, a focus on achievement rather than character, so how much money you own, what you do, your career rather than your personal characteristics, and relying on internal standards. So a lack of respect for authority, ability to work with unclear guidelines. And so as the country has sort of had these two sets of cultural norms, we do see other political divides, we see other cultural divides, and what sociologists are beginning to realize is that really is that American culture is changing. Before really the 1980s, the majority of Americans were socialized into one dominant culture. This would basically be this traditionalistic or this working class culture. And by 2020, now we have segments of the country that are socialized into still the traditionalist culture, but increasingly larger segments of the population, mainly in urban America, are being socialized in this professional middle class or this progressive culture. And that's kind of what we see as, or what we suspect is driving a lot of these differences on politics and religion and the nature of American society are driven by these two sets of cultural norms that are in some ways not diametrically opposed, but they view the world very, very differently. Yeah, go ahead, Zach.
No, go ahead.
Oh, and then I would say, those are sort of the differences that we see. But on the other hand, rural Iowa and rural America, as well as the problems of inner city America, share some of the same challenges. First is diversification. So people tend to make this assumption that rural areas are all white, and because of that people are not all that open to people of color moving in. And the reality is, what we know from the last round of the census data in 2020, that rural areas are rapidly diversifying. And in many, if you even take the case of Iowa, many of our rural cities and towns are just as diverse, if not more diverse, than the state's largest cities on a percentage basis, than the state's large cities and suburbs. I mean, we have probably about a half a dozen to 8 towns that are over 50% people of color. And that's unusual, even for our state's large cities. And so both urban and rural areas see this as an opportunity, and there's also going to present challenges on how, particularly in Iowa, how you begin to adjust to this situation where you have much more non-white and Hispanic people moving into our state and being part of the workforce, being part of the student base, being part of our new customer base. That's all going to require challenges. So that's a challenge that both rural and urban has to address. I think the other area where rural Iowa and particularly inner city Iowa, or just rural America and inner city America, is poverty. Poverty is both a problem in rural places and in urban places. Less so in Iowa, but much more so nationally. Is that there's a lot more poor rural communities than there are urban communities. But on the other hand, the majority of the nation's poor lives in cities. And so basically there's been this underinvestment in both the most rural, remote places and the most densely populated urban centers. There's been an underinvestment in education, jobs, healthcare, housing. And so we talk about in my field, you see the emergence of both rural ghettos and urban ghettos. That the contexts are very different, of course, kind of where it occurs and the type of community, but the challenges they face are the same, of just lack of underinvestment in jobs, healthcare, housing, and just general upper mobility opportunities. And last, I think where sort of the most remote rural communities and some of the most core inner city areas in the United States is there's this anger about being left behind, that the country is leaving them behind, that they've lost their economic role in society. For example, in rural America, that used to be a relatively low-cost manufacturing. That's been lost to Southeast Asia primarily, both in rural communities and in inner cities. A loss of local jobs in their community or neighborhood, loss of local schools, loss of healthcare, loss of grocery stores even. So the food desert issue is both a rural issue and it's an inner city urban issue as well, lack of grocery stores. And that's because our national policies really favor the wealthy and the upper middle classes. It doesn't really favor rural America, and it doesn't really favor the inner city. It favors sort of the suburban areas of our metro areas. And you see this in the lack of upward mobility, increasing lack of upward social mobility of young kids coming from the most remote rural areas, as well as the lack of upward social mobility of young kids growing up in inner cities. So these are some common challenges that both rural people and urban people face. So this allows, that's why this sort of false dichotomy of rural versus urban, there is some truth to it in the first things I mentioned, but there are also a lot of common issues that rural and urban people need to find common ground on and begin to work together to advocate for their communities.
Well, thank you, Dr. Peters, for those opening remarks. I know that puts kind of the issue in good detail, and there are a lot of different ways to go. And kind of big picture, I know you mentioned some of the challenges, the job creation and schools, governments, and agriculture being major employers. Some of that shift was underway prior to COVID, watching those declines. And are you just now kind of starting to get a good look at, maybe that it exacerbated some of the trend changes there?
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of population, the interesting thing is that outmigration before COVID was a major problem in rural Iowa. During COVID, that stopped. Everyone stayed put during those, 2020 and 2021. But now we're getting data from 2022, and we'll get the 23 data here shortly. What we're seeing is that even though COVID slowed out migration from rural Iowa into larger cities quite a bit, what we're seeing in the 2022 data is that things are just going back to normal, that people are again beginning to leave the cities. So there was a hope among many small towns across the state and across the country that people would consider moving. That sort of the after effect of the pandemic is that people would actually want to move out to a small town to escape kind of the worst of the pandemic. And a lot of towns had quickly developed recruitment programs to recruit people from urban cities to move out to rural towns, small towns, particularly in Iowa. And, some did, but really that's not changing things. What it is that people essentially moved out to the suburbs. They didn't really move out to the small towns. So there was hope that would lead to a rural rebound in population as people wanted to escape large cities during the pandemic, but we're not really seeing that in the data. Now, in terms of jobs, as I mentioned earlier, one unfortunate sign is that the bounce back from COVID, the return of rural jobs hasn't happened as it's had in urban areas. That means that those jobs lost during COVID are not coming back. Whereas in urban areas, we do see a big sharp, it's like a V shape almost. We do see a pretty sharp rebound of jobs in urban areas in both Iowa and the US, but we're not seeing that in rural areas. And that's a worrying sign that we've lost a lot of those job opportunities in rural Iowa, and we're unlikely to get them back.
Do you feel that that's the case, or could it be a lagging indicator, maybe that takes a little bit longer?
Yeah, I mean, it could definitely be a lagging indicator. We'll have to see. I mean, maybe rural Iowa or rural communities will take a little bit longer to get those jobs back. And it's not as if we haven't seen some growth, but it hasn't been a very pronounced growth. So whereas cities, it might have taken 1 or 2 years to recover those jobs, we might be talking a decade for many rural communities. And the issue becomes, can they outlast a decade of slow job growth without losing large numbers of people? So this is a problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you've been involved in kind of studying the rural communities across the state for some time, and a lot of your work with the Shrink Smart initiative and other projects are kind of focused at, maybe the trend data gets set aside a little bit, but you're also working on, those that are still there. How, in the work that you've seen with Shrink Smart, I mean, the majority of Iowa towns and cities probably aren't going to grow based on those census data, and
Right.
So I'm curious, how do you get past the idea that declining population, is like a loss or a failure?
Well, you don't. We know of it because we know the data, we understand the data. We're not really from those communities, but even when we go into towns that are shrinking, they don't really see themselves. So you can show them the data, you can explain the trends, you can tell them that this is unlikely to change. But these are people that have chosen to stay in their communities. They have a strong attachment to their towns, and quite frankly, they don't really care. They wish their town would grow. They believe their town will eventually grow, but they sort of carry on because they believe that their town has a future. So a lot of these efforts to promote quality of life and to try to make their communities, a better way, a better place to live, is because they think it will position them to eventually grow in terms of population. So, we tell them that, need to accept this fact that shrinkage is probably going to be the state of things for decades to come. But a lot of the communities in our town just simply, they don't choose to accept that, and they just kind of carry on and say, we're going to try to make our town the best place to live, despite if people continue to leave. And in some ways, they don't let the shrinkage define them. They think their town are great places to live, and in many cases they are great places to live, and they think that people will eventually realize that. Or, maybe they change that definition of success, that maybe instead of, bringing hundreds of people into your town, maybe it's okay to bring in 5 to 10 new families into your town. That gives the community a new sense of vibrancy. It's some sign of success. So really, they kind of change the metric. And I should say as well that, part of the losses that we see in most of rural Iowa are a result of the baby boom generation. And so the boomers were a very large cohort, and they sort of skewed a lot of our demographic data. And right now, a lot of the boomers do tend to live in smaller communities and rural communities. And part of the sizable population losses we see are from that boomer age cohort. So we think in another 10 years, another maybe 20 years, as the boomers, God forbid, eventually pass away or move out of the state for more permanent retirement, or move out of rural communities into more permanent retirement, that we will see some of those loss numbers stabilize. So it's a bit of a statistical artifact in the sense that the boomers were such a large cohort, there were so many people to begin with, and as they age, as most people do, they tend to leave, go retire somewhere else, or people pass on, that a lot of that population loss is due to that boomer cohort. So we do expect those populations to stabilize, but we don't really expect them to start growing again.
Now, this past weekend, we featured some of the communities that that your team at Iowa State has identified as shrink smart communities. And I'm curious, did they self-identify, or how were they, brought into this kind of study and kind of the coaching that they've gotten?
Yeah, so what we did is I run something called the Iowa Small Towns Project, and as part of that project, we have a poll or a big survey that we conduct among 99 small towns in Iowa. That's one for each county, and we send them a survey and we ask them what they think of the quality of their services and local amenities, how often they volunteer, what their perceptions of local leaders are. So just kind of ask a whole array of questions about topics that we can't get from secondary data, meaning population data and economic data, because there's much more to a community rather than just the demographic structure and the jobs and the income. There's much more to, do people feel happy about their town? Are people satisfied living there? So our poll tries to measure that. And so what we wanted to find out is, are there towns that have shrunk in terms of population faster than average population loss, but also had above average gains in quality of life? Because the general narrative that you hear nationally and in the media is that rural areas are declining. Population, they're losing population, they're losing people, they're losing jobs, and their quality of life is deteriorating. So that's the narrative, that everything is in decline, not just population, but sort of all aspects of community life. And so we were interested, are there towns that have sort of managed to buck this trend, against all odds, that they're shrinking fast, yet quality of life has been growing very fast. So we were able to combine the census data with the Iowa Small Town Poll data, and we identified a number of those communities, something like a dozen communities, fit that profile. Now, a lot of our small towns do fit that declining profile, declining population, declining quality of life. But there were the small number of towns that were sort of had this counter trend. And so what we wanted, since the data only tell us so much, then what we did is we went into about 6 of these 12 towns. Now it's probably up to 8 of the 12 towns as the project's gone on since 2017. And we've gone in and we've basically interviewed local leaders in the community and asked them, what do they think about that, and how do they maintain quality of life? So, to answer your question, Zach, that the term shrink smart, it's sort of, they like half of the term and they dislike the other half. So they like the smartness part. They know their towns have great quality of life. These towns have been working diligently to build fitness centers and daycares and healthcare clinics. And so they know their towns have a good quality of life. Of course, they kind of bristle at the shrinkage part. But we went in, they wouldn't really identify themselves as a shrinking town, even though they know their population is declining. They really see themselves as vibrant places, as places where people can come together to initiate projects get done. They're the kinds of projects that people really want in their day-to-day lives. And that's what's vibrancy, that's success for them, not necessarily, following what the census comes out with every year and what's your population. They're not letting some outside federal agency, define their community and what success means. And so they really focus on the quality of life and the smartness part, and they tend to not really care about the shrinkage part. Yeah.
I'm curious, the difference in mindset. Is that just completely the members of the community, how well they know each other? Or are there other factors that come into play that, some towns are, more willing to keep bringing new ideas forward than others?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's kind of a interesting question. There's a couple things. I think that So we went into towns that were shrink smart and we did interviews, and we also did interviews in what we call these declining towns, and we tried to compare, what did we see or not see between these communities. And so the differences mainly were that in the shrink smart towns, a couple things. One, I think I mentioned these, in the article on Sunday, but basically had leaders that were very proactive, and all towns have leaders. The difference was the style of leadership that was practiced in the shrink smart towns. And so there's this concept called shared leadership, where local leaders really try to encourage others to take leadership roles. The leadership structure is very decentralized. It doesn't function within a government setting. It functions within sort of the community organizations and community foundations. And it really allows people to be creative in addressing issues. So the shared leadership is much more of the leader using their personal gravitas and personal charm to encourage people to volunteer, to be a champion for their town, and to be a convener among all these groups and individuals to try to make things work out. So first was, there was a distinct style of leadership that wasn't the traditional top-down, I'm the mayor, I'm going to make all the decisions, all the decisions and all the all the tasks are going to come from the top down. But really, in these shrink smart towns, the leadership was really kind of a bottom-up approach, that the leaders sort of step back, let other people take control and charge of sort of particular parts of a project and let them run with it. And so there's this concept that we've kind of come up with. It's been in sociology for a while, but it's called entrepreneurial social infrastructure. So what these towns have is a dense social infrastructure. As you know, as you were saying, everyone knows each other, a lot of people volunteer, there's commitment to the town, people have confidence that the town is going in the right direction. And a lot of towns have that, but the missing ingredient in a lot of these is that entrepreneurial spark, if you will. And so these towns, what people were able to do is come together in creative ways to address problems that, quite frankly, when we visited these towns, we were in awe of how they've tried to, address these problems. So it's not just having the social connections, because a lot of towns do have these social connections. It's having this leadership, this certain style of shared leadership, and it's also taking a very entrepreneurial approach to problems. And part of that entrepreneurial approach, or part of this having this entrepreneurial culture in these shrink smart towns, is accepting failure. Like any entrepreneur or small business owner will tell you that, failure is kind of part of it, that you're going to fail. And in many of the shrink smart towns, they did fail, but they didn't let the failure stop them from trying. Where in some of the declining towns, we would hear stories, yeah, we tried that and it didn't work out, and everyone was kind of soured on everything, and no one really picked up the ball again and tried to run with it. So really, it's this entrepreneurial social infrastructure that really matters. And what I mean by social infrastructure, it is not entrepreneurialism such as in starting a business, so that could be part of it. It's really entrepreneurial in starting daycares and fitness centers, as I said before, and health clinics and community festivals and trying to get healthcare professionals into town, really using that untapped creative entrepreneurial talent that exists in small towns to address community issues, not just obviously, kind of earning money and creating jobs, which of course is important. But the other side of that is important as well, kind of dealing with local services and amenities in the town.
I'm curious, when you're talking about this, how does scalability or kind of that next person in, or on the flip side of it, burnout, if one or two people are really good at the diverse leadership, obviously I think you need more than that to make things go, but how do you keep sustainable energy? These aren't things that happen quickly.
Right. I will give you a little bit of a background. So in our when we kind of did our analysis, some of the shrink smart towns I should say many of the Shrink Smart towns have been doing this for 20 or 30 years. They've just have managed to keep this going for a very long time. And part of that is that because their leadership style is very decentralized, a lot of people have those leadership skills. And so unlike in some of the declining towns where it was one person or two people that sort of drove everything, and when those people stepped aside, no one was trained up to take over that leadership role. Whereas in the Shrink Smart towns, because these conveners and these champions really try to encourage new people and young people to take leadership roles, there was this constant mentoring of young leaders and new leaders coming in. So they always had a pipeline. And so when someone had to step away, let's say they got busy with work, or they're busy with their kids when they were in school, or maybe someone had a health issue, or a loved one had a health issue and they need to step away for a year or two, there was always, in these Shrink Smart towns, there was always someone willing to step up, because these Shrink Smart towns made that a conscious strategy to try to encourage that next generation of leaders. So instead of having, 3 to 4 leaders in the town, these Shrink Smart towns might have 10 to 14 leaders in the town. But as you said, burnout is still an issue that, even in the Shrink Smart towns, it's the same 20 or 25 people that are involved in everything. And, that's better than in a lot of other small towns where it's mainly the same 5 to 10 people that show up. And so the Shrink Smart towns do have sort of a depth of leadership base, but it still only comes down to 25 people, pretty much. And so there is the issue of burnout. And so that's why we do see some fluidity between these towns. For example, one community in Northwest Iowa always had very strong growing quality of life. It was always had very good quality of life. And then their school shut down. And that community went into a bit of a tailspin for about 3 to 5 years, where the leadership structure essentially collapsed. Quality of life ratings began to drop according to our polling. And so it used to have this leadership, but because of the school closure and burnout, and some people moved away, it can regress. But now, they're beginning to get things started again. So you can have towns that have always had great leaders, the shared leadership and great quality of life. It can go negative. On the other hand, we do have a number of small towns. These remains I'm thinking of are mainly in central Iowa and north central Iowa that really had very dismal quality of life 20 years ago, but it took 2 or 3 people to really decide, hey, we really want to make a change. They brought more leaders into the fold. They brought new volunteers into the fold, and by today, they're doing amazing things. And so you can, you can become a Shrink Smart town, and you can drop out of being a Shrink Smart town. So it is fluid, and like you mentioned, it is, there is that risk of burnout. It's hard to maintain over time. Some of it's within local control, some of it is not within local control, as the one I mentioned, the school closure that really wasn't, I'm sure they preferred not to have their school closed, but the state kind of, forced their hand, and they had to close and consolidate their school. But yeah, these towns can drift in and out of the Shrink Smart concept. That's why it takes continual renewal.
Well, I'm curious. I know you're getting ready for the small town poll. It's done once every 10 years. And can you talk a little bit about what's going to be different this time? This is the first time post-COVID that you're going to be into the field, but I think you're adding additional communities this time around, correct?
Yeah, that's right. We're adding 26 additional towns, and one of them is so one of our towns was Pacific Junction. That's on the far west end of the state, right by the Missouri River, and that was completely inundated in 2019. And so the population in Pacific Junction has dropped by over 75%. And so that community is, I haven't been there in about a year, but we had to replace that town just because the natural disaster happened. The feds did a lot of buyouts. There's not many people left in those towns, so we had to get a replacement town nearby. But really, the other 25 towns that we added were these what we call larger regional trade centers of around 4,000 to 6,000 or 7,000 people. And so a lot of our towns are very small. There's some with populations of 300 people, but what we really wanted to find out is if you think about rural development, it's a bit of like a hub and spoke. We think of it like a hub and spoke model. That yes, you can have towns of 300 people as long as they're nearby a town of 4,000 to 5,000 to 7,000 people that will have some large employers. They'll have a larger healthcare facility. They're likely to have a community college or a satellite campus of the community college. But we're really thinking now that even though small towns are important to track, really the future vitality of rural Iowa hinges on these towns of 4,000 to 7,000 people, because they're the ones that provide jobs to all the smaller towns. They're the ones that provide healthcare to all the smaller towns in the region. They're the ones that provide higher education. So we wanted to know what's going on in these larger regional towns because they are so critically important. So for example, if a town of 6,000 people loses its major employer, it not only affects that community, but it probably affects 24 other communities surrounding it, because people commute into those areas for jobs. Or if that town of 5,000 to 7,000 people loses its hospital, that it's not just that community that suffers that cost. It's probably a number of communities in a 3 or 4 county area. So we really want to begin to understand with the new wave by adding these towns, understanding these larger regional trade centers. And the other big thing we're doing is we're partnering with a number of organizations to really understand the impact of COVID-19 on meatpacking workers, and also how rural people of color, how are things going? We haven't really done that in previous waves, and so there's 6 communities in the ISTP that are over 50% people of color. We hate to use the word minority these days in towns where over half the people are non-white or Hispanic. But we're working with LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, as well as Embark, that's a group for Southeast Asians. And each of these groups have local chapters in each of the meatpacking towns, and to really reach out to people of color and of new immigrants. They're going to help us with getting outreach. They're going to help us with translation. It's not just Spanish. It's sort of almost a babble of languages that are spoken in a lot of these meatpacking towns. But really trying to work with local partners in these 6 meatpacking towns to really get meatpacking workers and immigrants and their families to fill out the survey, just so we can have a better understanding of what's working and what isn't working so well in their small towns.
From a standpoint of, you collect the data, what's your hope then with what gets done with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the hope is that, one of the advantages of the poll is we've been doing this since 1994. And so we're able to track these same towns, almost going on over 30 years now. And so it allows us to see, well, what happens to a community that went being from majority white to 50%, less than 50% white in the span of a couple decades? Like, how does that happen? How does that work? And so what the data allows us to do is to sift through all these small towns in Iowa and try to identify towns where we think interesting things are going on. So the analogy would be like the Shrink Smart project. How would you identify towns that are doing a good job at growing quality of life? Well, how do you know that? So the data allows us to get a handle on, here are the towns that are doing particularly well at something, here are the towns that are not, and the data only tells us so much. And then that allows us to get a small number of towns where we think something interesting is happening, and actually go into those communities and do interviews, do focus groups, kind of document the effective strategy. So what we hope that the data does is, one, kind of raise awareness of rural issues, but what we also hope is that the data allows us to identify communities that we will go in and visit and do interviews and try to identify effective place-based strategies to help other towns develop. Like what are the good practices that helped, Elma and Sac City and Bancroft? Like, what did they do to make their towns such great places to live? And if we can see enough commonality among these towns, then we can develop other materials that can help other towns try to follow in a similar suit.
Now, is the focus on that local policy and that local guidebook level,
Yeah.
or do you hope to do some, regional, county level, or even state level policy guidance?
Yeah, I mean, I think both. I think at all levels. I mean, one, from a very practical point of view, we hope that the best practices can be used almost immediately within local communities. But we also hope that those principles will translate up into state and federal policy. And one of the things that that's kind of happened already, the things that we found is that leadership is so critically important for state policymakers and federal policymakers to understand that leadership matters. I mean, you can't simply go into a community and give them money if they don't give them a large grant without the leadership in place to identify needs, to mobilize people to do the work. I mean, you need good leadership in place. And I think that, we didn't have a huge role, but I think we had a contributing role that Governor Reynolds' Empower Rural Iowa initiative, one of its main pillars is leadership. And so focusing on leadership is important. We also try to convey to state policy officials and federal policy officials, particularly with USDA, is that you need to understand that local control and the ability for local agency is so important in rural communities. Because what happens is, if you don't allow for some degree of local control or local discretion in projects, what ends up happening is that towns follow what lawmakers in Des Moines want, or what lawmakers in DC want, even though that might not be the need. So allow communities to identify local needs and priorities, give them flexibility in how to use the money, and come up with creative solutions. So really trying to make rural places not dependent upon state and federal grants, but really use the state and federal money to build local capacity for them to identify important needs that are relevant to their communities, not needs that are relevant in Des Moines, in the State House, or in Congress in DC, and to try to identify effective solutions to do that, because small towns are diverse. Even in Iowa, every town is a little bit different, and there's major regional differences between west central Iowa that's sparsely populated and remote, between like eastern Iowa, which is relatively densely populated and has some natural amenities, let alone if you're talking about, rural communities in the southwest of the United States, or in the mountain west, or in the deep south, or in the Midwest. I mean, these rural communities are in very different contexts, and so really having a one-size-fits-all rural policy really isn't going to work. That those policies really need to allow to be flexible, and we hope our project highlights is that when you allow, as I said, when you unleash the creative entrepreneurial talent that's in these rural communities, and you give them some seed money and maybe a little technical assistance, they can do great things, and they can come up with very unique and innovative solutions that no government official in state government or in the federal government would ever dream of. But that's kind of really where policy needs to be, really kind of helping rural communities, assisting them in identifying their priorities and needs, rather than dictating kind of what the priorities, needs, and solutions are.
I'm curious if there are 2 or 3 areas that you think come up repeatedly that maybe policymakers should be paying more attention to.
Yeah, in rural communities, jobs is always the big one. Kind of quality jobs. But the one thing that it's sort of the chicken and egg issue, that really it's the workforce. They simply do not have the people some communities simply don't have the people to work. Some rural communities have the people, but they're just not, for one reason or another, are unable or unwilling to work. So in many rural communities, there are jobs available. You know, the quality of those jobs varies depending on the region, but really they just can't get enough people to fill those jobs. And so a lot of the policies should be focusing on how do you encourage people into work or back into work. So that would include daycare centers, that would include programs to help people with transportation, since many of these jobs people have to commute to. Part of it would be housing. You know, if you're going to move to a rural community, you know, you want to find a place to live. And in general, there's enough homes in rural communities. It's not a number of housing units. It's really the quality of those housing units, that there are enough spaces, people can find a place to stay. Just the condition of those homes, the quality of those homes are not what people are looking for. So that would be, you know, three things I think. You know, good daycares that are open, you know, maybe until 6 o'clock and then don't charge extra, and that are relatively affordable, that allows people to go work and not having to be back by 2 or 3 in the afternoon. I think, you know, some sort of programs to encourage transportation, whether that's acquiring used vehicles, helping with repairs so people can get to jobs, and then, you know, I forget what the third one is now. Oh, and then the housing issue. Yeah, I mean, how do you begin to transform the existing housing stock into the types of homes that people want to buy? And that might help people move back to rural communities and help address some of the workforce shortages that we see.
Okay, I know we're coming up at the end of the hour, and I want to hold to the time that we told everybody we'd be working with today. But I guess one area that we are addressing later on this week is healthcare, and you know, the business side of that. I'm curious if that's come up quite a bit in some of the shrink smart communities, and what they're doing to get a handle there, or if you see some solutions that maybe are starting to bubble up.
Yeah, I mean, healthcare I think is critical for, I would say, healthcare and senior care services are sort of intertwined. And it's important for a lot of reasons. One, just from an equity issue, that everyone, no matter where they live in the state of Iowa, should have access to good health care. But secondly is that seniors play a very important role in most rural communities. They're oftentimes the local leaders. They have the time, they have the money, they have sort of the reputation to really lead projects. And so it's very important that we keep seniors in rural communities, and one way to do that is to strengthen the healthcare sector as well as sort of the home healthcare sector, like nursing homes and assisted living. And rural people rate, you know, healthcare as a priority. The problem, of course, is it's very difficult to maintain that. It's hard to find workers. The equipment's very expensive. There's a lot of rules and regulations that come with that. You just can't do it on your own. They have to, you know, there's a certification process. And you know, that's kind of the main issue. But I will say, in some of these shrink smart towns, they've come up with very creative solutions to doing this. One example in particular is Sac City. It's in west central Iowa, and the Loring Hospital there. We have a story, or you know, we documented a case where they had trouble in their hospital recruiting doctors in general, but also specialty doctors. And so a typical approach from the federal government and state government is to recruit a doctor to go live in the community locally. Now, the problem with that is it's expensive, the success rate might not be very high, the person might leave. And so what Sac City did is use this entrepreneurial social infrastructure, and the community went to, partnered with a larger hospital in Sioux City and said, if you come out for an entire day, we will make sure you are booked from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. You'll see patients all day, and you can come out once a month, and you'll make money, and our residents will have that service. And so what that required Sac City to do is to make sure they had volunteers to drive all the people that needed to get to their appointments in the county to Sac City for the hospital. So it was a very creative way. Instead of recruiting a doctor or 3 or 4 doctors, instead now what they have is a number of specialists drive in once a month, maybe twice a month, and they see patients all day. So it's a way to get good quality health professionals in your community, but using a very creative strategy, using that social capital in the community to get people to volunteer their time to make sure everyone schedules their appointment that day of the month, that everyone has transportation, so there's volunteers that have to drive people. It's a very creative way to solve a healthcare workforce shortage.
Mhm.
So I think that's a pretty empowering story. And then the little city of Elma, population 550, they decided they hadn't had a health clinic ever, and they decided they wanted one. So they came together. They had fundraisers. Their foundations raised money. The community was able to put together a grant, so they had funding from the state. They had a lot of foundation money, and they were able to open a small healthcare clinic in their town. And so that was done through a lot of local work, but also with government being a partner on that. And so I think in healthcare, there are a lot of opportunities to address some of these healthcare workforce shortage issues and just access issues, but by really working with local communities to try to figure out, well, what do you think would work in this community? What ideas do they have? Because they're the ones at the end of the day that have to sort of do the heavy lifting to make it work. And
Mhm.
some of these towns do an amazing job. So again, I would say just unleashing this entrepreneurial creativity to come up with unique solutions to pressing problems.
Well, I appreciate those examples. I think that they're very helpful just as we're thinking about some of the different solving problems and looking at solutions. So I appreciate you sharing those. As I mentioned, we're at the end of our time, and I want to say thank Dr. Peters for his time and his patience with the technology today. Again, I apologize for that.
It's
But
probably Iowa State's fault.
I'm not saying that either. But no. I appreciate you taking the time with us. And for those the remainder of the week sessions, I mentioned them. Tuesday is maintaining services in rural areas. Wednesday is bringing new ideas into action. Thursday looks at workforce, and Friday looks at keeping education vibrant in rural communities. And so please, if you don't get a chance to take those in live, we will have the replays available on iowaideas.com. Main registration for the conference, that's October 12th and 13th, is also open. And that is a virtual conference again. So we have the opportunity to bring in folks from Iowa and beyond. And we'll be doing that October 12th and 13th. And registration for that is open at iowaideas.com as well. So Dr. Peters, again, thank you for your time this afternoon. And thank you to everyone who took part.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.